At 21 hours 13 minutes on May 29, 1944, Lieutenant Commander G. L. Conkey stood on the bridge of USS Eugene E. Elmore, watching his sonar operator track a German submarine 300 feet below the Atlantic Ocean. Around him, the night was chaos. USS Block Island, the only American aircraft carrier ever sunk in the Atlantic, was sliding beneath the waves. USS Bar wallowed dead in the water, her stern shattered by a torpedo. 673 sailors floated in the oil-slicked sea, waiting for rescue. And somewhere below, U-549 was trying to escape. Conkey had one weapon that could kill without losing sonar contact, 24 spigot mortars mounted on his bow. Each projectile weighed 65 pounds and carried 35 pounds of Torpex explosive. They would sink at 23 feet per second in a circular pattern 130 feet wide, and unlike depth charges, they would only explode if they hit something hard. Something like a pressure hull. He gave the order. 24 projectiles arced into the darkness and splashed into the Atlantic. Then silence. The sonar operator maintained contact. 300 feet below, Kapitänleutnant Detlev Krankenhagen maneuvered U-549 through a sharp turn, trying to evade the pattern he couldn't see descending toward him. The projectiles missed, but Conkey never lost contact. At 21 hours 27 minutes, Elmore fired again. 30 seconds later, the sonar operator reported 3 explosions. 3 projectiles out of 24 had found their target. 4 minutes after that, every man on the bridge heard a sound that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. A deep, grinding explosion as U-549's pressure hull collapsed under the weight of the Atlantic. All 57 German crew members died instantly. This was not the first submarine killed by this weapon. It would not be the last. But it represented the culmination of a development process that had taken 3 years, overcome massive institutional resistance, and required a complete reimagining of how ships hunted submarines. The weapon was called Hedgehog, and its story began with a problem that had killed thousands of Allied sailors. In 1940 and 1941, German U-boats were winning the Battle of the Atlantic. Allied shipping losses exceeded 700,000 tons per month. Convoys crossing from America to Britain faced coordinated wolfpack attacks. Ships burned on the horizon every night. The Royal Navy's primary anti-submarine weapon was the depth charge, a drum filled with 300 pounds of TNT or Torpex, set to explode at a predetermined depth. Ships dropped them off the stern or fired them to the sides using mortars called K-guns. The depth charge had one critical flaw. It required the attacking ship to lose sonar contact before the attack. The mechanics of the problem were simple but devastating. Sonar, called ASDIC by the British, sent sound pulses forward and to the sides using an underwater dome mounted beneath the ship's hull. The system could detect submarines thousands of yards away in good conditions. The sound pulse would travel through the water, bounce off the submarine's steel hull, and return to the receiver. By measuring the time delay, operators could calculate range and bearing. But sonar had a fundamental limitation built into its physics. Directly beneath the ship, the sonar transducer created a blind cone. No echo could return from that area. The blind cone extended from directly under the hull to roughly 200 yards ahead, depending on the submarine's depth. The deeper the submarine, the wider the blind cone. When a destroyer detected a submarine, the tactical procedure was standard across all Allied navies. Increase speed to maximum. Close the range as quickly as possible. The faster the ship moved, the less time the submarine had to escape, but increased speed created massive propeller noise that masked the sonar return. The attacking ship essentially became deaf at precisely the moment it needed maximum information about the target. As the destroyer closed to within 200 yards, the submarine disappeared into the blind cone. The attacking ship had to estimate the submarine's depth, set the depth charges accordingly, and drop them without any knowledge of where the submarine actually was. This created what submariners called the escape window. From the moment sonar contact was lost until the depth charges exploded, 90 seconds. In 90 seconds, a submarine at 100 feet depth could dive to 250 feet or rise to 50 feet. It could execute a turn of 60 degrees or more. It could change speed from creep to flank. An experienced commander could move his boat 300 yards in any direction while simultaneously changing depth by 100 feet. The depth charge exploded at a preset depth. If the attacking ship guessed 150 feet and the submarine was at 250 feet, the explosion occurred 100 feet above the target. The pressure wave dissipated quickly with distance through water. A depth charge needed to detonate within 15 feet of the pressure hull to cause catastrophic damage. Beyond that range, it might crack welds, damage equipment, spring leaks, or terrorize the crew, but it would not sink the boat. German U-boat commanders became experts at exploiting this gap. Training at the submarine school in Pillau emphasized the critical moments when sonar contact broke. Instructors drilled commanders on evasion tactics that could save a boat. The moment U-boat hydrophone operators heard propeller noise accelerating overhead, signaling an incoming attack, the commander would execute his evasion. Full rudder one direction. Blow ballast to rise or flood tanks to dive. Change speed. Shut down all non-essential equipment to reduce noise. The goal was to be somewhere, anywhere, other than where the attacking destroyer thought the submarine would be when the charges detonated. The crew endured these attacks in near total silence. Orders were whispered. Men moved on soft-soled shoes. Every piece of equipment that could make noise was secured or shut down. In the control room, the commander and his officers plotted escape vectors on charts. In the torpedo compartment, men lay in their bunks trying not to think about 300 pounds of TNT detonating overhead. In the engine room, mechanics stood ready to restart diesels if the boat surfaced or increase electric motor power if ordered to dive deeper. Then the depth charges began to explode. The sound underwater was unlike anything on the surface. A sharp crack followed by a pressure wave that squeezed the entire hull. Light bulbs shattered. Cork insulation flaked off the overhead and rained down on the crew. Valves leaked. Gauges cracked. Men were thrown against bulkheads if they weren't holding on. And the explosions kept coming. British doctrine called for patterns of 10 to 14 depth charges. American destroyers dropped patterns of 5 to 9 from stern racks and K-guns. Multiple ships attacking simultaneously could put 50 depth charges in the water in a single pass. The crew counted detonations, tried to estimate how close each explosion was, checked for leaks, reported damage, and waited for the next pattern. The statistics were brutal. Out of 5,174 British depth charge attacks during World War II, there were 85.5 kills, a ratio of 60 to 1. 60 attacks for every submarine sunk. Depth charges had another problem. They exploded, regardless of whether they hit anything. Every detonation created a massive pressure wave that disrupted sonar for 15 to 30 minutes. During that time, the submarine could escape. The attacking ship had no way to know if it had damaged the target or missed completely. Crews would hear underwater explosions and convince themselves they had scored a hit, when in reality the submarine had slipped away unharmed. And German submariners proved extraordinarily tough. U-427, a Type 7 U-boat commissioned on June 2, 1943, holds the record for depth charge survival. In April 1945, Allied ships and aircraft dropped 678 depth charges on U-427 during a prolonged hunt lasting many hours. The submarine survived every single one. The crew endured what must have been psychological torture. Hours of explosions, the hull groaning under pressure, leaks springing in a dozen places, equipment failures, electrical fires, air growing foul as carbon dioxide built up, and through it all, the knowledge that the next explosion might be the one that finally cracked the pressure hull and sent the ocean flooding in. U-427 never sank a single Allied ship during its entire service. It fired torpedoes at Canadian destroyers HMCS Hyder and HMCS Iroquois just days before the end of the war. Both torpedoes missed. The submarine surrendered at Narvik, Norway on May 8, 1945, having survived more depth charge attacks than any other U-boat in history. The survival demonstrated both the U-boat crew's skill and the fundamental inefficiency of depth charge attacks. 678 attacks over many hours, 0 kills. That was the problem the Royal Navy needed to solve. The Royal Navy needed a weapon that could attack while maintaining sonar contact, a weapon that only exploded on impact, so crews would know immediately if they had succeeded or failed. A weapon that gave submarines no time to evade. In 1940, the Royal Navy's Directorate of Miscellaneous Weapons Development was looking for solutions to problems other departments said were unsolvable. Their official acronym was DMWD. Everyone called them the Wheezers and Dodgers. The nickname came from their original title, Inspectorate of Anti-Aircraft Weapons and Devices, IAAWD. Someone corrupted it to Instigator of Anti-Aircraft Wheezers and Dodgers, and it stuck. The man in charge was Sir Charles Goodave, a Canadian, 40 years old. He had earned his PhD in photochemistry at University College London and lectured there before the war. He had also developed the degaussing system that protected Allied ships from magnetic mines. Goodave ran DMWD as what would later be called a skunkworks operation. Small teams, minimal bureaucracy, maximum experimentation. His staff included some of Britain's most creative technical minds. Lieutenant Commander N.S., Norway, who would become famous after the war as novelist Neville Shute, headed one department. The writer had initially been furious at being assigned to experimental weapons development instead of combat duty, but eventually came to appreciate the organization's unconventional approach. They worked from dispersed locations for security. HMS Birnbeck, a shore establishment at Weston-super-Mare on the Bristol Channel, served as the main base. The Fryth estate at Welwyn provided laboratory space. Breandown Fort, an abandoned Victorian fortification jutting into the Bristol Channel, became the testing ground where they could fire experimental weapons into the sea without bothering civilian populations. DMWD's development philosophy was brutally pragmatic. If a weapon worked, push it into production immediately. If it failed, scrap it and try something else. No committee reviews. No multi-year development programs. The war was happening now. Solutions were needed now. Their track record reflected this approach. Some spectacular successes that changed the course of the war. The bouncing bomb used in the famous Dam Busters raid of May 1943 was refined at DMWD facilities. Components of the Mulberry artificial harbours deployed for D-Day originated from DMWD designs. Rocket batteries that gave merchant ships defensive firepower against aircraft. The degaussing system that protected Allied ships from German magnetic mines. And some equally spectacular failures. The Panjandrum stands out, a massive wheel 10 feet in diameter, studded with rockets around the rim. The theory was that it would roll across a beach under rocket power and demolish German defences with a 4,000-pound explosive charge in the hub. In practice, the rockets fired unevenly, sending the Panjandrum careening wildly in every direction except toward the target. Film footage of the tests shows the device racing down the beach, bouncing over obstacles, changing direction at random, and eventually exploding harmlessly in the surf, while engineers and military observers scattered for safety. But DMWD learned from failures as quickly as they capitalized on successes. The Panjandrum became a cautionary tale about complex mechanical systems under combat stress. Future weapons would be simpler, more robust, less dependent on perfect conditions. In early 1941, an officer from MD-1, Churchill's toy shop, showed Goodave a weapon developed by Lieutenant Colonel Stuart Blacker. It was a spigot mortar. Instead of using a barrel, the propellant charge was contained in the projectile itself, which fitted over a steel rod, the spigot. When fired, the expanding gases pushed the projectile up and off the spigot. Blacker had designed it as an anti-tank weapon for the Home Guard. Goodave looked at it and saw an anti-submarine weapon. The concept was simple. Mount 24 spigots on the bow of a ship. Fire all 24 at once in a pattern ahead of the vessel. Each projectile would carry a contact fuse that only detonated when it hit a submarine's pressure hull. The ship could fire while still tracking the submarine on sonar. No blind period. No 90-second escape window. Simple in concept, extraordinarily difficult in execution. Goodave's team had to solve 5 technical problems, each of which seemed insurmountable. Problem 1. The contact fuse. The projectile had to survive impact with the Atlantic Ocean at 50 feet per second without detonating. Then it had to arm itself as it sank. Then it had to detonate on contact with a pressure hull but not on contact with anything else. The pressure differential between the surface and 400 feet depth was nearly 200 pounds per square inch. DMWD tested dozens of fuse designs at their Breandown Fort facility. Early prototypes detonated prematurely when they hit the water. Others failed to arm at all. Some armed but failed to detonate on impact. The engineering challenge was formidable. The fuse had to be simple enough for mass production, robust enough to survive being fired from a spigot mortar, sensitive enough to detonate on contact with a pressure hull, but insensitive enough not to explode when hitting the ocean surface at 50 feet per second. The solution came from adapting aircraft bomb fusing technology. A small propeller mounted on the nose of the projectile remained locked in place during launch. When the projectile hit the water and began sinking, water flow spun the propeller. The rotation drove a screw mechanism that armed the detonator. By the time the arming sequence completed, the projectile was safely underwater and descending. The fuse had another elegant feature. It required the propeller to complete multiple rotations before arming. This meant the projectile traveled a minimum safe distance through the water before becoming live. If a projectile somehow hit the attacking ship during launch, a catastrophic but theoretically possible failure, it would not explode because the arming sequence had not completed. Testing consumed months. DMWD engineers fired hundreds of projectiles into the Bristol Channel, recovered them, examined the fuse mechanisms, made modifications, and fired again. They tested at different water temperatures, different sea states, different impact velocities. Gradually, the design matured from laboratory experiment to production weapon. Problem 2 demanded equally intensive development. The projectile shape determined everything: aerodynamics during the launch phase, stability during water entry, sink rate and trajectory after submersion. Early designs tumbled or slid sideways after hitting the water. A projectile that entered the water nose first might immediately tip horizontal and skip across the surface before sinking. Another might penetrate cleanly but then tumble end over end as it descended, drifting far from the intended impact point. DMWD built a specialized test facility where engineers could measure projectile behavior in 3 dimensions. High-speed photography captured water entry. Underwater observers tracked descent patterns. Recovered projectiles showed impact damage and helped engineers understand failure modes. The team discovered that a flat nose created optimal water entry. The blunt profile generated drag that stabilized the projectile immediately upon impact. Angled, stabilizing fins prevented tumbling during descent. The fins were canted slightly to induce a slow rotation that further stabilized the projectile's trajectory. The final design measured 7.2 inches in diameter at the widest point, with a total length of 46.5 inches. Weight was 65 pounds fully loaded, with 35 pounds of Torpex explosive in the warhead. The projectile sank at approximately 23 feet per second in seawater. That meant it would reach 200 feet depth in under 9 seconds. A U-boat at 200 feet had less than 10 seconds from the moment projectiles hit the water until detonation. Problem 3. The firing pattern required both mathematical calculation and experimental validation. The goal was to maximize hit probability against a maneuvering submarine while keeping the pattern dense enough that at least 3 or 4 projectiles would strike the target. DMWD engineers built what they called a roulette wheel test apparatus. They mounted a scale model submarine on a rotating platform and positioned it at various orientations. Then they threw weighted miniature projectiles at the model from different angles and distances, simulating the actual weapon's ballistic arc. Each throw was recorded. After thousands of trials, patterns emerged. A circular pattern roughly 140 feet by 120 feet at 250 yards range gave optimal coverage. If the submarine was anywhere within that ellipse, probability calculations showed at least 3 or 4 projectiles would hit. 24 projectiles created enough density to ensure hits, even if the submarine was turning or changing depth during the attack. The projectiles did not all land simultaneously. They splashed into the water over a period of about 2 seconds, creating a spread in both time and space that made evasion nearly impossible. Problem 4. Recoil. 24 spigots firing simultaneously created enormous force. If not properly calculated, the recoil could destabilize a destroyer or rip the mounting from the deck. One DMWD engineer witnessed Millis Jefferis, one of Blacker's colleagues, spending an entire train journey from Bath to London frantically calculating recoil coefficients on empty cigarette packets. When the train reached Paddington Station, Jefferis smiled. His numbers worked. Problem 5. Explosive power. The projectile had to penetrate the pressure hull on contact. 35 pounds of Torpex proved sufficient. A direct hit would crack the hull open. Most submarines that were hit did not implode, they simply flooded catastrophically. The crew had seconds, maybe minutes. Then the ocean poured in, and they sank. HMS Westcott, a W-class destroyer from World War I, received the first Hedgehog installation in August 1941. The ship became the test platform. Trials began in September. The weapon worked. But convincing the Royal Navy to adopt it was another matter entirely. Traditional naval officers viewed Hedgehog with suspicion. It looked crude, a collection of spigots jutting up from the bow like porcupine quills. The name itself, Hedgehog, seemed undignified compared to traditional naval armament. More importantly, depth charges had a psychological advantage. When a destroyer dropped a pattern of charges, the crew felt they were doing something. Massive explosions, geysers of water, the ship vibrating from the concussion. Even if the attack failed, it felt aggressive and powerful. Hedgehog was silent unless it hit. A miss meant 24 projectiles sinking quietly to the ocean floor. No explosions, no feedback. Crews found it unsatisfying. There was also the problem of initial success rates. Even after 100 ships had Hedgehog installed by the end of 1942, there were no confirmed submarine kills until November 1942. The weapon was achieving about a 5% kill rate, barely better than depth charges. Gudev needed a demonstration that would convince the Admiralty's leadership. He arranged a trial for Admiral Sir Dudley Pound, the first Sea Lord. The demonstration took place at a testing ground near a chalk pit. Gudev and his team set up targets and prepared the Hedgehog launcher. Word reached Professor Frederick Lindemann, Churchill's scientific advisor, who suggested to the Prime Minister that he might want to observe. On the morning of the demonstration, the testing ground swarmed with military police checking credentials at multiple checkpoints. Security was tight. The weapons being demonstrated included not just Hedgehog but other secret DMWD projects. When Gudev and Captain Davies arrived, they discovered they had no proper security passes. The demonstration was scheduled to begin in minutes. Missing it would be catastrophic for Hedgehog's prospects. Davies, thinking quickly, grabbed some engineering documents from the car, completely unrelated to security clearances, and waved them confidently at the guards. The military police, seeing official-looking papers and assuming these men must be important if they were arriving in a staff car, waved them through without detailed inspection. Churchill, Admiral Pound, senior officers from all three services, and civilian scientific advisors assembled on a grassy slope overlooking the testing ground. Gudev's team had set up targets representing U-boat silhouettes at various ranges. The demonstration began with other weapons. Then came Hedgehog's turn. The launcher fired. 24 projectiles arced through the morning air in a graceful parabola. They impacted the water in a tight pattern. Seconds later, explosions erupted as the projectiles struck the submerged targets. The detonations were impressive, violent enough to throw water geysers 30 feet into the air. Churchill watched with keen interest. The Prime Minister had a deep appreciation for unconventional weapons and the scientists who developed them. He had personally championed many DMWD projects, earning the organization political protection that allowed them to operate with minimal oversight. The next morning, Admiral Pound summoned Gudev to the Admiralty. "This anti-submarine gun of yours," Pound said without preamble. "How soon can you arrange for it to be deployed operationally?" The first Sea Lord promised all possible assistance. Production priority, material allocation, shipyard capacity for installations, whatever DMWD needed to get Hedgehog into the fleet. The demonstration had achieved its purpose. Political and military support was secured. Production began immediately at multiple facilities across Britain and, eventually, in the United States under reverse Lend-Lease. By early 1943, Hedgehog equipped over 100 Royal Navy escort vessels. The weapon was available. Trained crews were using it. But something was wrong. Captains were avoiding Hedgehog attacks. When their ships detected submarines, they reverted to depth charges. DMWD started receiving reports of ships making sonar contact, then declining to use the Hedgehog mounted on their bow. The Admiralty issued a directive. Any captain equipped with Hedgehog who made submarine contact had to file a report explaining why they had not used the weapon. The responses revealed the core problem. Crews did not trust Hedgehog. They viewed it as unreliable. Heavy North Atlantic weather would soak the launcher deck. Water would seep into the firing circuits. When the order came to fire, sometimes the full pattern launched, sometimes only half the projectiles fired, sometimes nothing happened at all. There was also the silence problem. A depth charge miss still produced explosions that boosted crew morale. A Hedgehog miss was just nothing. The projectiles splashed into the ocean and disappeared. No feedback, no confirmation that the attack had even happened. It felt like failure even when the crew had executed the attack perfectly and the submarine had simply evaded. Success rates remained at 5%, 1 submarine sunk for every 20 attacks. Goodave sent an officer from DMWD to Londonderry in Northern Ireland. The Royal Navy's main escort base, HMS Ferret, was located there. It was the westernmost port in the United Kingdom, providing the fastest access to the Atlantic convoy routes. Most of the escort vessels operating in the North Atlantic refueled and resupplied at Londonderry between convoy runs. The DMWD officer's mission was simple: talk to every crew equipped with Hedgehog, explain how the weapon worked, share examples of successful attacks, build confidence. He conducted what would later be called town halls, shipwide briefings. He brought crews together in groups and walked through attack procedures. He explained the contact fuse mechanism. He showed them how to maintain the firing circuits in wet conditions. He brought data on successful attacks and explained exactly how those attacks had worked. The training focused on the most critical element: maintaining sonar contact during the attack. With depth charges, the attacking ship accelerated to high speed, creating enormous noise that masked the submarine. With Hedgehog, the ship could approach slowly, 10 knots, quiet enough that the sonar operator could track the target continuously. The weapons officer could time the firing to match the submarine's projected position. It required precision. It required teamwork between the bridge, the sonar operator, and the Hedgehog crew. But when done correctly, it was devastatingly effective. The results were dramatic. Within months, the kill rate climbed from 5% to 20%, 1 submarine sunk for every 5 attacks. By the end of the war, statistics showed that depth charges achieved 1 kill per 80 attacks. Hedgehog achieved 1 kill per 5 attacks, a 12-to-1 improvement in effectiveness. In May 1944, USS England, a Buckley-class destroyer escort, demonstrated exactly how lethal a well-trained Hedgehog crew could be. The United States had received Hedgehog through reverse lend-lease in late 1942. American shipyards installed the weapon on destroyer escorts, purpose-built anti-submarine vessels that were smaller and slower than fleet destroyers, but optimized for convoy protection. England's commanding officer was Commander W. B. Pendleton. His executive officer was Lieutenant John Williamson, a technical specialist who understood both the capabilities and limitations of Hedgehog better than almost any officer in the U.S. Navy. Before England left San Francisco for the Pacific, Williamson conducted unauthorized tests of the Hedgehog system by firing projectiles into San Francisco harbor. The tests violated numerous regulations and could have resulted in his court-martial if anything had gone wrong, but Williamson needed to know exactly how the weapon performed under operational conditions. He needed to verify firing circuits, measure pattern dispersal, test the contact fuses. The tests confirmed what British reports had indicated. When properly maintained and correctly employed, Hedgehog was devastatingly effective. Williamson became a true believer. He trained England's crew relentlessly. The training focused on coordination. A successful Hedgehog attack required the bridge, the sonar operator, the weapons crew, and the engine room to function as a single organism. The bridge maneuvered the ship into attack position. The sonar operator maintained continuous contact and fed range and bearing data to the weapons officer. The weapons crew trained the Hedgehog launcher and prepared to fire. The engine room maintained precise speed, usually around 10 knots, slow enough to keep the ship quiet but fast enough to maneuver. Williamson drilled his team on what he called the approach geometry. The attacking ship needed to close on the submarine from an angle that kept the target in sonar contact as long as possible. Too steep an approach, and the submarine would disappear into the blind cone before the ship reached firing range. Too shallow an approach, and the submarine could turn inside the attacking ship's turning radius and escape. The optimal approach was a slight curve that brought the ship to within 250 yards of the submarine while keeping the target in sonar contact until the moment of firing. At that instant, the weapons officer would trigger the Hedgehog. 24 projectiles would launch in a staggered pattern. The ship would continue on its course, passing over the location where the projectiles had entered the water. If the projectiles hit, explosions would follow within seconds. If they missed, silence. The sonar operator would maintain contact throughout, allowing immediate reload and second attack. In mid-May 1944, Admiral Soemu Toyoda, commander of the Japanese Combined Fleet, needed intelligence. American naval forces were gathering at Manus Island, in the Admiralty Group, and in the Marshall Islands. Toyoda needed to know if they would attack the Palau Islands or the Marianas. He deployed 7 submarines in a picket line, extending from Truk to the waters west of Manus. The submarines were spaced at 30 nautical mile intervals. Their mission was to report any major fleet movements. American codebreakers intercepted and decrypted the Japanese orders. Fleet Radio Unit Pacific, FRUPAC, knew exactly where each submarine would be. On May 13th, FRUPAC intercepted another message. Japanese submarine I-16 was delivering rice in 75-pound rubber bags to the bypassed garrison at Buin on Bougainville Island. England, USS George, and USS Raby were ordered to intercept. On the afternoon of May 19th, at 13 hours 35 minutes, England's sonar operator Roger Bernhardt detected I-16 at 1,400 yards. His voice carried across the bridge. "Strong, clear echo, sir." Williamson took personal control of the attack. I-16 was a veteran submarine. She had survived 9 war patrols, conducted multiple resupply missions to bypass Japanese garrisons, and her commander, Lieutenant Commander Yoshitaka, was an expert in evasion tactics. Yoshitaka executed standard Japanese submarine doctrine the moment his hydrophone operator reported propeller noise. Radical course changes, speed variations, depth adjustments. I-16 twisted through the water like a wounded animal, trying to shake the pursuing destroyer escort. Williamson maneuvered England into firing position. Range, 1,200 yards. Course, converging at 15 degrees. Speed, 10 knots. The sonar operator called out bearings. Bearing 018, range 1,000. Bearing 022, range 800. Bearing 024, range 600. At 13 hours 41 minutes, first attack. 24 projectiles arced forward and splashed into the Pacific. Williamson counted seconds. The projectiles sank at 23 feet per second. I-16 was estimated at 100 to 30 feet depth. Time to impact, under 6 seconds. Silence. Miss. Yoshitaka had timed his evasion perfectly, turning hard just as the projectiles entered the water. But England maintained sonar contact. Williamson reloaded and repositioned. Second attack at 13 hours 53 minutes. 1 projectile detonated. The explosion indicated a hit, but I-16 continued maneuvering. The submarine had survived, though possibly damaged. Yoshitaka was running out of options. His battery was draining. His crew was exhausted. The attacking ship showed no signs of breaking off the engagement. And most critically, the destroyer was maintaining continuous sonar contact. There was no blind period, no opportunity for a clean escape. Third attack at 14 hours 10 minutes. Williamson misjudged the depth. His fathometer showed the submarine at 200 feet, but later analysis indicated I-16 was actually at 325 feet. The projectiles missed above the target. But England maintained contact, reloaded, repositioned. Fourth attack evaded. Fifth attack at 14 hours 33 minutes. Williamson adjusted his depth estimate based on the earlier miss. This time, the geometry was perfect. 4 to 6 projectiles detonated in rapid succession. The underwater explosions were so violent they lifted England's stern out of the water. Men on the fantail were thrown off their feet. The ship's entire structure vibrated from the concussion. 20 minutes later, debris began floating to the surface. Cork insulation, pieces of wood, oil. Over the next day, the oil slick expanded to cover a 3 by 6 mile area. I-16 was destroyed, all 107 crew dead. On May 20th, FRUPAC decoded another message. 7 Japanese submarines were forming a patrol line north of the Admiralty Islands. Row 104, Row 105, Row 106, Row 108, Row 109, Row 112, and Row 116. They were positioned to intercept American aircraft carriers, moving along a route Admiral Halsey had used twice before. The 3 American destroyer escorts, England, George, and Raby, were ordered to roll up the Japanese submarine picket line from one end to the other. On the night of May 22nd, George detected RO-106 on radar at 03 hours 50 minutes. The submarine dove. George attacked with Hedgehog and missed. England regained contact at 04 hours 25 minutes. First attack missed. Second attack at 05 hours 01 minutes scored at least 3 detonations. A massive underwater explosion followed as England prepared for a third attack. After sunrise, debris and a heavy oil slick confirmed the kill. May 23rd. Raby detected RO-104 on radar at 06 hours 00 minutes. The submarine dove. Raby made 4 Hedgehog attacks, all misses. George made 5 attacks, all misses. By 08 hours 10 minutes, 9 attacks had failed to hit the submarine. England took over. First attack missed. Second attack at 08 hours 34 minutes scored 10 to 12 detonations, breaking up noises. 3 minutes later, a large underwater explosion. Debris appeared at the surface at 10 hours 45 minutes. May 24th, 01 hours 20 minutes. George detected Row 116 on radar. England made sonar contact at 01 hours 50 minutes and fired. 3 to 5 detonations at 02 hours 14 minutes. No major explosion followed, but breaking up noises indicated the submarine was dying. At sunrise, oil and debris covered several square miles of ocean. 3 submarines in 5 days. On May 26th, a hunter-killer task force built around escort carrier USS Hoggett Bay arrived to relieve the 3 destroyer escorts. England, George, and Raby headed for Manus to refuel and resupply. On the way, they detected another submarine. Row 108 surfaced briefly at 23 hours 04 minutes. England gained radar contact, then sonar contact, as the submarine dove. First Hedgehog attack at 23 hours 23 minutes, 4 to 6 detonations. RO-108 went down with all 53 crew. 4 submarines in 8 days. After refueling, the destroyer escorts sailed back to the patrol line. On May 31st, they detected RO-105. This submarine had a veteran commander, Lieutenant Junichi Inoue, and carried Captain Ryonosuke Kato, commander of Japanese Submarine Division 51. The attack began at dawn. George and Raby made over 20 Hedgehog attacks. All missed. The engagement lasted 25 hours. Division Commander Haynes, aboard George, ordered England to hold back. But nothing was working. At 07 hours 30 minutes on June 1st, Haynes radioed, "Oh hell, go ahead, England." Williamson manoeuvred into position. At 07 hours 36 minutes, England fired, 6 to 10 detonations. At 07 hours 41 minutes, a massive explosion. Oil and debris fountained to the surface. Row 105 was destroyed with all 55 crew. 5 submarines in 12 days. Admiral Ernest King, Chief of Naval Operations, sent England a message. There will always be an England in the United States Navy. England's performance was never matched by any other ship in World War II. 6 submarine kills in 12 days using Hedgehog. It demonstrated what the weapon could accomplish in the hands of a trained, confident crew. But Hedgehog's most historically significant kill, at least for American forces, came 15 days before England began its rampage. On May 29, 1944, USS Block Island, a Bogue-class escort carrier, was hunting U-boats west of the Canary Islands. Block Island commanded Task Group 21.11, which included 4 destroyer escorts, USS Ahrens, USS Barr, USS Eugene E. Elmore, and USS Robert I. Payne. Block Island was the only American aircraft carrier sunk in the Atlantic during World War II. She went down because of U-549. Captain Lieutenant Detlev Krankenhagen commanded U-549, a Type 9C/40 U-boat. He had departed Lorient on May 14th for his first combat patrol, carrying a cargo of rice for resupply missions. For 6 days, Task Group 21.11 had been hunting U-549 around the Cape Verde Islands without success. At 20 hours 15 minutes on May 29th, an hour before sunset, Krankenhagen slipped through Block Island's destroyer screen. He fired 3 torpedoes. 2 hit Block Island. The carrier began sinking immediately. Barr charged toward the U-boat's position and dropped 11 depth charges. U-549 dove deep and evaded. Krankenhagen fired 1 homing torpedo at Barr. It struck near the stern, crippling the destroyer escort. Arends and Payne moved in to rescue Block Island's survivors. Arends stopped her engines to pick up sailors from the water. With engines silent, Arends' sonar operator picked up U-549 at 21 hours 02 minutes. Commander Morgan Harris, Arends' captain, radioed Eugene E. Elmore. Lieutenant Commander Conkey, commanding Elmore, was the only ship free to attack. Barr was crippled. Arends and Payne were stationary, recovering 673 survivors from the water. Conkey steamed toward the contact, bearing 275 degrees from Arends. Elmore's sonar found U-549. At 21 hours 13 minutes, Elmore made its first Hedgehog attack. Krankenhagen, listening through his hydrophones, executed a doubling back maneuver. Full rudder to port. Reverse course. He timed it to coincide with what he thought would be the sonar disruption from depth charge explosions. But there was no disruption. Hedgehog projectiles that missed just sank silently. Elmore maintained perfect sonar contact. Conkey reloaded and positioned for a second attack. At 21 hours 27 minutes, Elmore fired again. 30 seconds later, sonar detected 3 explosions. 3 projectiles out of 24 had hit U-549's pressure hull. 4 minutes later, every man in the task group heard the final explosion as U-549's hull collapsed. The submarine was at 300 feet when it imploded. The implosion killed all 57 crew instantly. U-549 was the only success Krankenhagen ever achieved. He had sunk 1 carrier and damaged 1 destroyer escort. In exchange, he and his entire crew died in the Atlantic. Block Island sank at 21 hours 55 minutes. The depth charge ammunition magazines exploded as the carrier went down, creating a shockwave so violent that Arends was lifted nearly out of the water. Many Block Island survivors thought they had been torpedoed again. But U-549 was dead. Hedgehog had avenged Block Island within 42 minutes of the carrier's torpedoing. By the end of World War II, Hedgehog had fundamentally changed anti-submarine warfare. Total statistics: 5,174 British depth charge attacks for 85.5 kills. Ratio: 60-1. 268 Hedgehog attacks for 47 kills. Ratio: 5.7-1. Of the last 16, U-boats sunk by U.S. Navy surface ships, 11 were destroyed by Hedgehog or similar ahead-throwing weapons. The weapon worked because it solved the 90-second problem. Submarines could not escape during a blind period because there was no blind period. Ships maintained sonar contact throughout the attack. Projectiles only exploded on impact, so sonar remained clear after a miss. Crews could immediately reload and attack again. Hedgehog's success forced the Kriegsmarine to accelerate development of acoustic homing torpedoes like the Falke. These torpedoes could be fired without periscope observation, allowing U-boats to attack while staying deep and hidden. But by 1943, when these torpedoes entered service, Allied anti-submarine technology had already advanced beyond what acoustic torpedoes could counter. In late 1943, the Royal Navy introduced Squid, a 3-barreled mortar that fired depth charges ahead of the ship. Squid had some advantages over Hedgehog, particularly against deep targets, but Squid required the Q attachment, a depth-finding sonar that did not become available until 1943. Hedgehog worked with standard sonar and was simpler to manufacture and deploy. The United States developed Weapon Alpha and Mousetrap as Hedgehog replacements, but both were less effective. Hedgehog remained in service with the U.S. Navy into the Cold War until it was replaced by ASROC in the 1960s. Lieutenant John Williamson, England's executive officer who trained the crew to such devastating effectiveness, later reflected on the 6 submarine kills. Some crew members expressed discomfort at how easily Hedgehog destroyed enemy vessels. After Row 104 was sunk, a young sailor asked Williamson how many men had been on that submarine and how he felt about killing them. Williamson replied that there were probably 40 to 80 crew and that war was kill or be killed. But somehow, he wrote years later, when I finally reached the wardroom, that cup of coffee didn't taste as good as I thought it would. The crews of U549, I-16, Row 104, Row 105, Row 106, Row 108, and Row 116 never knew what hit them. They heard the attacking ship approaching. They executed evasion maneuvers. Then, without warning, explosions tore through their pressure hulls. If the hits cracked the hull completely, death was instant. The submarine imploded in milliseconds. If the projectiles only ruptured ballast tanks or damaged the hull without full penetration, the crew had time. Seconds or minutes to realize they were sinking. Water pouring in, no way to surface, no way to escape. Then the final implosion, as the hull reached crush depth. For surface ship crews hunting submarines, Hedgehog removed one psychological burden while adding another. They no longer had to wonder if their depth charges had hit. If Hedgehog projectiles exploded, the submarine was dead, but they also had to live with the knowledge that their weapon provided no chance of escape, no gradual pressure build-up, no time for the submarine to surface and surrender, just instant catastrophic damage and death. Charles Goodeve and his Wheezers and Dodgers team at DMWD developed many weapons during World War II. Some succeeded, some failed. But Hedgehog stands out as one of the most significant tactical innovations of the Battle of the Atlantic. It worked because it solved a specific problem with ruthless efficiency. The 90-second blind period had killed thousands of Allied merchant sailors. Hedgehog eliminated that blind period. Submarines that had exploited the gap for years suddenly found themselves hunted by a weapon they could not evade. The weapon required 3 years to develop, overcome massive institutional resistance, and prove its effectiveness. But once crews understood how to use it, Hedgehog became one of the deadliest submarine killers of the war. 47 confirmed U-boat and submarine kills from 268 attacks, a 20% success rate that was 12 times better than depth charges. And in 12 days, in May 1944, one American destroyer escort sank 6 Japanese submarines, demonstrating exactly how devastating Hedgehog could be in the hands of a trained crew. USS England's sonar operator was Roger Bernhardt. USS Eugene E. Elmore's commander was Lieutenant Commander G.L. Conkey. These were real people who hunted and killed submarines using a weapon developed by a Canadian chemist and a team of British inventors who called themselves the Wheezers and Dodgers. The weapon was Hedgehog, 24 spigots, 65-pound projectiles, contact fuses that only exploded on impact with a pressure hull. It changed submarine warfare forever. And every submarine crew in the Atlantic learned to fear the silent splash of projectiles hitting the water above them. Because silence meant they had missed, and explosions meant you were already dead.